Thank you. Thanks everyone very much for your patience and for joining us. I'll get started, and as a few more folks joining in as we go. But yes, good morning or good afternoon or good evening, wherever you're joining us from. I'm Helen Buckland, CEO of SOS, and I'm really delighted to welcome you to launch Funding Change That Lasts, which is a new handbook for conservation funders who want to ensure long-term impacts through community-centred conservation programmes. This is supposed to be a really practical new resource, and we've developed it over the course of the last year in consultation with conservation practitioners, with anthropologists, and with forward-looking grant makers. It's really designed to address one of the most pressing challenges in conservation, which is how we fund change that genuinely lasts. There's several familiar faces on the call today, including some of our own wonderful funders, people who've invested time and insight into developing this handbook, and we're really pleased to have Liz McClelland with us, our Trust and Foundations Manager, who's led on the project, and David Jay, who's the author of the handbook as well. So welcome everybody. Thank you again so much for joining us today. A few bits of housekeeping just before we get started. I'm just going to start off, say a few words, and we'll hear from two guest speakers who are going to share their insight into what meaningful community engagement truly entails, and then I'll run through the handbook itself. There will be a chance for some Q&A towards the end, so do pop your questions into the chat as we go, and we are recording the event for the benefit of the people who weren't able to join us this morning. Okay. So I'll just start off with a bit of scene setting about why we wanted to create this resource. At SOS, we've got over 20 years of experience supporting and learning from incredible partners on the front lines of conservation in Indonesia. And we all know that, at least in some landscapes, securing long-term protection for wildlife and forests is out of reach if local communities aren't taking up authentic roles in conservation efforts, which themselves need to be grounded in a really nuanced understanding of the specific local context. There's a lot of terminology that references the role of communities in conservation programmes. We use in the handbook and within SOS the term community-centred conservation to refer to programmes that might be initiated by external actors such as NGOs, as opposed to community-led conservation, which is initiated by the communities themselves, but in which the community has a central role in planning and decision making, contrasting with community-based approaches which might not centre the community in those vital planning processes. I'm going to make what I think is a fairly safe assumption that everyone on this call today, whether you're a conservation practitioner or an environmental funder, shares a common goal, and that is to create benefits for biodiversity and local people through long-term changes in the way that nature is valued, managed and protected. So funders actually have a really pivotal role in the evolution of conservation practice, and by adapting the way that you evaluate proposals, invest in conservation partnerships and support throughout the lifetime of a programme, you can foster the widespread adoption of rights-based and evidence-based participatory approaches to conservation. At SOS, that really helps us to ensure that our conservation interventions are not imposed on, but really genuinely embraced by the communities we work with. We know that this approach takes time, oodles of tenacity, but we wholeheartedly believe that that approach is key to achieving resilient solutions and lasting changes which really disrupt the drivers of biodiversity decline. So our hope with this handbook is that it can help to guide philanthropists and funders and donors in pursuing a goal that we all share, which is, of course, change that lasts. So before we dive into the handbook, I am delighted to welcome Lina Silaban and Hannah Farozamira via pre-recorded message to avoid the pitfalls of time zones and Wi-Fi connectivity. So Lina is the Westover Landscape Conservation Manager at Tahuka, our incredible frontline partners. Tahuka really walks the talk when it comes to these principles of meaningful community engagement. They, in fact, have more anthropologists on their team than ecologists, which I think is pretty unusual for a conservation organisation and really demonstrates their commitment. And Lena's going to be sharing some reflections on how the community-centred approach is enriching the work that she leads in West Tabor. And Lena's perspective is also featured in the handbook itself. And our second speaker, Hannah, is an SOS trustee. She's an ESG analyst with a particular interest in impact investing. And throughout her academic and professional career, Hannah's been a really strong advocate for rights-based approaches to conservation. And her unique perspective comes from that intersection of environmental, social, and governance principles. So before we hear from Hannah and Lena, just a quick reminder that we'll have an opportunity for some Q&A, so do drop your questions in the chat as we go.
Halo, selamat pagi.
Selamat pagi.
Hari ini kita mau bincang-bincang bareng Kalina ya.
Baik.
Dapatkah Anda ceritakan bagaimana fasilitator desa Tahukah melakukan pendekatan untuk mempelajari dan membangun kepercayaan dengan masyarakat di Toba Barat?
Baik, terkait dengan bagaimana fasilitator desa Tahukah melakukan pendekatan dengan masyarakat di lanskap Toba Barat itu merupakan sebuah proses yang panjang dan bukan pekerjaan yang mudah. Mereka harus terjun kepada masyarakat, mendekatkan diri kepada masyarakat, dan meleburkan diri kepada masyarakat. Karena proses pendekatan ini bukan sesuatu yang bisa dilakukan dalam 1 atau 2 bulan, tetapi proses yang panjang dan menyatu dengan fasilitator desa. Bagaimana mereka bisa memahami dan mendalami masyarakat secara utuh.
Oke, seperti apa proses membangun kepercayaan ini dari hari ke hari? Bisakah Anda jelaskan beberapa kegiatan
Apologies.
atau interaksi yang membantu mewujudkannya?
Ya, karena ini adalah proses yang panjang, proses yang tidak bisa dicapai dalam 1 atau 2 bulan, tetapi membutuhkan waktu yang panjang untuk memahami masyarakat. Jadi fasilitator desa itu harus hidup bersama masyarakat. Bagaimana kebiasaan mereka, keseharian mereka, ikut terlibat di dalam aktivitas mereka. Bahkan mungkin beberapa kali mereka harus ikut berbincang dengan masyarakat di warung atau di perkumpulan-perkumpulan kaum ibu, perkumpulan-perkumpulan kaum bapak, dan ikut juga melakukan aktivitas di kebun atau ikut memancing. Jadi apapun kegiatan di masyarakat itu, fasilitator desa mengikuti, bukan hanya untuk berkamuflase supaya mereka bisa terlihat baik kepada masyarakat, tetapi itu adalah cara fasilitator desa mendekatkan diri supaya mereka diterima, dan itu menjadi metode mereka untuk bisa berbincang lebih dalam kepada masyarakat.
Bagaimana sih pendekatan ini berkontribusi dalam mendapatkan izin perhutanan sosial hutan desa Sibagindar?
Ya, tentu pendekatan dengan masyarakat ini merupakan sangat berkontribusi ya untuk mendapatkan akses perhutanan sosial. Karena melalui pendekatan ini, fasilitator desa itu banyak memberikan bertukar informasi kepada masyarakat yang melakukan aktivitas di kawasan hutan, baik itu mengeluarkan HHBK atau mungkin aktivitas-aktivitas lainnya. Jadi ketika fasilitator desa ini melakukan aktivitas bersama dengan masyarakat, disitulah terjadi transfer informasi ataupun transfer ilmu, di mana fasilitator desa ini menceritakan apa kira-kira itu perhutanan sosial, bagaimana mendapatkannya, dan apa manfaat yang diterima oleh masyarakat. Dan fasilitator desa ini juga bukan hanya bekerja sendiri bersama masyarakat, tetapi juga didukung juga oleh kepala desa Sibagindar yang merupakan mitra kita yang bisa kita ajak berdiskusi dan juga bekerja sama terkait dengan kegiatan-kegiatan Tahukah begitu. Jadi bagaimana si kepala desa sebagai pemerintah desa juga membangun komunikasi kepada KPH untuk membantu mengakses izin perhutanan sosial.
Menurut Anda, mengapa pembangunan kepercayaan ini sangat penting untuk keberhasilan ini?
Ya, kenapa penting? Karena menurut saya tanpa kepercayaan program apapun yang kita bawa ke desa itu tidak akan pernah berhasil. Karena kepercayaan itu mengikat kita lebih jauh dan lebih panjang bersama masyarakat. Jadi masyarakat perlu diberikan pengetahuan yang benar begitu. Dan ini adalah proses yang kita lakukan melalui pendekatan dan hidup bersama masyarakat. Supaya kita memahami sebenarnya apa yang mereka butuhkan. Apakah yang kita lakukan ini akan memberikan dampak yang baik kepada mereka dan juga memberikan manfaat yang dalam jangka panjang. Jadi hal-hal itu yang akan membuat tingkat kepercayaan itu meningkat, dan ketika tingkat kepercayaan meningkat kita bisa membawa kegiatan-kegiatan itu bersama mereka dan juga melibatkan mereka secara penuh.
Adakah momen atau cerita lain yang menonjol bagi Anda di mana pembangunan kepercayaan membuat perbedaan besar dalam pekerjaan Anda?
Kalau itu berkaitan dengan saya dan pengalaman saya, yang paling menonjol saya rasa mungkin bukan pendekatan saya kepada masyarakat, karena yang terjadi adalah pendekatan kepada masyarakat banyak dilakukan oleh fasilitator desa, dan saya banyak dibantu oleh fasilitator desa dalam membangun komunikasi kepada masyarakat. Tapi berdasarkan pengalaman saya, yang paling menonjol adalah bagaimana komunikasi dan koordinasi saya dengan pemerintah. Ternyata pendekatan dan membangun kepercayaan ini bukan hanya dari tahukah kepada masyarakat, tetapi juga dari tahukah kepada pemerintah. Karena pada dasarnya banyak sekali NGO atau LSM yang ditolak oleh kehadiran mereka oleh pemerintah karena dianggap sebagai kontra, atau si NGO atau LSM tersebut merasa bahwa pemerintah itu adalah pihak yang kontra, yang tidak mendukung kegiatan-kegiatan mereka. Tetapi melalui pendekatan ini saya rasa menjadi cara yang efektif begitu. Jadi ketika contohnya adalah kepada KPH. Jadi ketika saya datang ke KPH, awal-awal saya memperkenalkan diri, lalu memperkenalkan lembaga, ya mungkin mereka belum sepenuhnya percaya begitu. Lalu seiring berjalannya waktu, setiap ada kegiatan kita melibatkan mereka dan membangun koordinasi secara reguler. Saya datang dalam 1 bulan, saya mungkin satu kali akan datang ke kantor mereka untuk sekedar berbincang, sekedar mengupdate informasi. Dan ini membangun kepercayaan kepada mereka. Jadi ketika ada kegiatan yang juga mereka lakukan, mereka akan mengajak kita gitu. Dan kehadiran kita ketika datang ke kantor mereka, mereka akan membuka pintu mereka dengan lebar untuk bisa membangun diskusi dengan kita.
Baik, bagi siapapun yang bekerja di bidang konservasi dalam konteks yang sama, saran apa sih yang akan Anda berikan tentang pentingnya membangun kepercayaan dengan masyarakat?
Ya, saran saya kepada teman-teman yang juga melakukan kegiatan di bidang yang sama termasuk di konservasi adalah mari mulai peka dan juga mengubah strategi pendekatan kita kepada masyarakat. Jangan melakukan kegiatan dengan orientasinya kepada program atau proyek, tetapi hidup bersama masyarakat, pahami mereka dan ketahui apa yang mereka butuhkan yang sejalan dengan keberlanjutan lingkungan, apa yang bermanfaat bagi mereka dalam jangka panjang.
Mengapa Anda percaya bahwa hal ini penting untuk mencapai tujuan konservasi jangka panjang?
Ini sangat penting dalam konservasi jangka panjang, karena ketika kita sudah memenangkan hati melalui membangun kepercayaan kepada masyarakat, mereka akan dapat menerima kita dalam jangka yang panjang juga. Jadi proses ini memang harus kita tanamkan dan menyatu di dalam diri kita dengan tulus untuk melakukan pendekatan kepada masyarakat, karena masyarakat juga bisa merasakan apakah kita tulus untuk melakukan kegiatan itu atau tidak.
Oke, last but not least, apakah ada hal lain yang ingin Anda bagikan tentang pekerjaan Anda atau pelajaran yang telah Anda pelajari tentang bekerja dengan masyarakat untuk konservasi?
Iya, sedari sejak awal bahwa banyak sekali masyarakat yang merasa bahwa kehadiran kita dianggap sebagai pengganggu bagi mereka gitu, karena menghalangi aktivitas mereka. Nah, karena itu saya merasa bahwa kita sangat penting untuk meletakkan diri kita seperti mereka, melihat dari kacamata mereka dan memahami dari perspektif mereka. Karena memang pemahaman kita yang dari luar yang kita bawa kepada mereka itu tidak sepenuhnya bisa diterima oleh mereka, karena mereka mungkin sudah punya kebiasaan, punya pengetahuan tertentu juga. Tapi kehadiran kita dengan hidup bersama mereka, sehari-hari bersama mereka, mereka akan lebih mudah untuk menerima dan juga kita bisa membangun komunikasi dan koordinasi dengan baik bersama mereka.
Terima kasih Kalina buat
Terima
bincang-bincang
kasih.
paginya.
Fantastic, great to hear from Lena, and yeah, benefit from her insight into how these approaches and principles are being brought off the page of our strategy and into the field with some fantastic communities we're working with in Sumatra. So we'll hear now from Hannah, just a short message from Hannah.
Hello, my name is Hannah Zamira, and I'm honored to be here in my capacity as a trustee at the Sumatran Orangutan Society, or SOS. In addition of being a trustee, I've spent much of my career engaging in conservation and sustainability efforts across Indonesia, so the mission of SOS is very close to my heart. I joined SOS because of its unique and powerful approach to conservation, one that combines rights-based framework with a strong foundation in evidence. This balance is incredibly difficult to achieve, especially when working in complex landscapes, such as those beyond protected areas. What stands out most to me about SOS is that the way the organization builds conservation efforts from the ground up, working hand in hand with communities as the frontline partners, providing not only financial support, but also the strategy guidance and technical expertise. They truly understand the value of co-creating conservation plans with those who live and work alongside these forests. After all, it's not just about funding the projects and initiatives in orangutan habitat areas, it's about meaningful and collaborative partnerships. This deep collaboration ensures the plans are practical, rooted in local knowledge, and built for long-term success. At the same time, SOS remain nimble and adaptive, able to respond quickly to new opportunities or challenges as they arise. One of the key messages I want to share with you today is about the importance of focusing on the longevity of conservation impact at every stage, from planning, development to delivery. It's crucial to think beyond immediate results. Real lasting conservation success requires careful groundwork. This includes building positive relationships with all the stakeholders, communities, local authorities, and private sector. These relationships take time to cultivate and may sometimes feel intangible or difficult to measure, but they are the bedrock of success. Without this foundation, conservation funding becomes a much riskier investment, as the plans or the project it supports are less likely to endure. That's why I'm so proud of SOS commitment to this painstaking but essential work. To all the funders joining this webinar, thank you so much for your dedication to conservation and for being part of this important discussion. By aligning funding practices with community-centered approaches, you can help ensure that conservation efforts are not only effective, but also long-lasting and enduring. Let's work together to create a future where both orangutans and communities who live alongside them can thrive. Thank you. Hello.
So Lena and Hannah shared a couple of key messages that I kind of wanted to underline, I suppose. Firstly, that unwavering focus on the longevity of conservation impact, and directly linked to that, the substantial amount of time and resource that needs to be directed to activity that might on the surface not look like what we might perceive conservation activity to be, but before the explicit forest protection work can begin, it's really important to invest the necessary time, effort and energy in that foundational work. Some of this work is, of course, difficult to measure. It can feel perhaps intangible sometimes, but the depth of the roots that we put down in the early stages will have a direct link to the resilience of the outcomes in the long term. And I also just want to return to highlighting the vital role that funders play here, not just as donors, but as investors in conservation outcomes. We really view grants as investments which, they don't yield profit in the traditional sense, but they're creating a valuable return in the form of meaningful impact through restored ecosystems, strengthened community resilience, thriving natural landscapes. And of course, there's a growing body of evidence, some of which is signposted in the handbook, that community-centred conservation is a key strategy to de-risk your investment in protecting nature. And that applies to both the private sector, but also environmental philanthropy. So to the handbook itself, I just want to run through what you can expect to find within its pages. The handbook brings together a set of recommendations about how to weave these principles into funding practices and processes. And we've been really fortunate to be able to capture the experience, the insights and the ideas of funders and conservation practitioners that are already breaking new ground in this area. So a big thank you again to everyone who has contributed to the development of this resource. We hope that it provides really practical guidance to help you evaluate and support the kinds of proposals that lead to transformative results through aligning the prosperity of local communities with the protection of wildlife and habitats. So many of you, of course, are very familiar with the limitations of short-term grant cycles and output-driven funding. These frameworks often encourage projects that only scratch the surface of community engagement. And we've seen that that in turn can lead to projects that are at best transient in their impacts, more commonly having no real impact at all, and at worst can actually breed distrust and disillusionment with conservation amongst the very people whose lives are intertwined with the fate of nature on their doorsteps. And for the funders here today, and those who've been involved in crafting the handbook, much of the rationale for providing long-term flexible funding is already very well understood. And of course, there's an ever-growing movement and evidence in support of social justice, I should say, in the environmental sector. I think it is important to explicitly acknowledge that there are a number of complexities and trade-offs in funding and delivering conservation programs that embody these principles, not least finding balance between the urgency of scale and pace on one hand and the necessity for depth and durability on the other. And we do know, of course, that the problem is urgent, but we also know that our solutions have to outlive our actions. And we recognise that this work can appear to move perhaps more slowly when viewed from a distance. It can be more complex, less straightforward to report on, which I'll come back to shortly. But having said all that, we warmly welcome the momentum towards trust-based philanthropy and the many funders who are pursuing that. Yet there are many more traditional environmental funders out there, and traditional funding processes are often fundamentally not compatible with community-centred conservation. It's perhaps an obvious point, and I don't want to labour it too much. You know, we all want longevity of impact, and what we really want to emphasise beyond that fairly obvious point is that the shifts in conservation planning and delivery that are needed to create those deep roots within ecologically vulnerable landscapes, and how funding practices can support and enhance those really fundamental early stages. So in the handbook, we share an overview of the major differences between community-centred conservation programmes and more traditional community conservation approaches. I won't go through all of this in great detail now. You'll all be receiving the handbook in your inboxes shortly. I just wanted to highlight that many of the project elements that might be determined pre-proposal in a traditional framework should be co-developed with the community once the engagement is underway under a community-centred model. And there is a definite shift from rigid plans to adaptive management. And I just want to as well draw your attention to the impacts line. Under traditional models, biodiversity benefits are quite often, they tend to be assumed, given that not enough time will have elapsed to be able to meaningfully quantify these within the scope of a project. But under a community-centred model and a much longer term investment and collaboration in a landscape or with a programme, there's far greater opportunity to track direct ecological indicators and verify those biodiversity benefits. So I suppose a key takeaway really is that funding models that are a good fit for community-centred conservation programmes allow for constant adaptation and reinvention. And of course, as we know, social, economic and political dynamics are constantly evolving in the landscapes we're working to protect. So our conservation programmes and efforts and strategies must be able to do so as well. So within the handbook, we also share a framework looking at the various phases of a community-centred programme and the types of funding that are most enabling for each of those. Traditional funding towards project-based activities can sometimes be appropriate, usually during the site selection and the adaptive delivery phases, as long as flexibility can still be built in. But we really encourage funders to consider and invest in the whole life cycle of a programme. The scoping and the co-creation phases can't be skipped, and they really do require resources in the form of staff time and logistics. These are not overheads, these are the beginnings of the investment in the programme. There's also an outline of the types of data and reporting that are suitable for each phase. Note that defining the objectives, the potential activities and some possible outcomes is actually an output in itself from that co-creation phase. At SOS, we are pretty obsessed with data and evidence. So we're not recommending at all that quantitative indicators are abandoned by any means, but we do suggest that a heavier focus on more qualitative measures of progress is more appropriate in the earlier stages and throughout, and that defining the most meaningful quant indicators should actually be done collaboratively with the communities. The handbook also includes a set of core principles that underpin a review of funding strategies and structures and processes, touching on grantee selection, understanding the theory of change, flexibility and trust, commitment and collaboration within the funder community as well. We've seen lots of interesting work being done with pooled funds, which is a very encouraging movement. And we will send out a link to the handbook to all of you after the call so that you can dive into all of those details. And we really do warmly welcome feedback as well. We'd really love to hear, you know, which parts are most interesting and relevant, and which parts you may see potential in adopting within funding practices in your organisations. So to sum up, conservation is evolving, and that's driven by a growing recognition of the empowerment of Indigenous peoples and local communities, and new methods that centre communities in the planning and decision making are proving not only to be more just, but also more effective in delivering long-term benefits for biodiversity. However, as we've spoken about, these approaches often differ quite significantly from traditional conservation models, and that can create barriers to securing the funding that's needed. At the same time, many funders are recognising a disconnect between established funding practices and the outcomes they aim to achieve. And while that awareness is growing, particularly within the conservation sector, best practice alternatives are still not particularly widely established. So that change, direction of travel, it requires dialogue and collaboration between funders and grantees and potential grantees, you know, sharing experiences, understanding perspectives. You know, we know, for example, that funders also have accountability about the funding that they're investing. You know, embracing these principles of flexibility, trust, and long-term commitment, and funders can really align processes with and therefore enable the wider adoption of these community-centred approaches. And we consider that shift really crucial for fostering resilient and equitable conservation outcomes. So, as I say, we hope that the handbook will serve as a valuable guide for funders that are ready to embrace that change. And we really hope that you'll dive into it, look into the details of it, but also share it far and wide within the funder community. So really just to say, if you want to know more about SOS programs and how we manage our relationships with long-term funders and our long-term programs in Sumatra, excuse me, or even more detailed advice into any aspect of the handbook and how to develop your funding processes to become really enabling to community-centred conservation partnerships, then we would be delighted for you to be in touch. So I will stop there. And Liz, do we have any cues that have popped up in the chat while I've been talking?
Just in private chat, I had a question, how to overcome challenges of reporting activity where a grant's been given to pay for the initial community relationship development, because of that, the time frame where the conservation outputs aren't likely to be seen for some time after that grant period. How do we address that and make the reporting valuable and relevant?
Yes, absolutely. Well, I think the types of reporting that are reasonable and suitable for the different phases is something that we go into a bit more detail on in the handbook. And I think that the various phases of a program could be adopted within a funder's own practices in terms of the framework of what's expected at each stage. Let me just, sorry, get the handbook up in front of me so that I can comment on the specifics of the reporting recommendations. I think a lot of continuous narrative and dialogue between funders and grantees to really understand the theory of change, the length of time that co-creation and relationship building phase might take, the coming through the inevitable hurdles and opportunities and challenges that will pop up even in that phase, together to you've got a really strong understanding of what's actually happening in the field on the ground, will help funders to understand the direction of travel, the progress that's being made, the depths of the relationships across communities, but also government stakeholders, other NGOs, private sector in the landscape, with the ultimate goal in mind of the preservation of a particular landscape or a species or whatever the goal of the programme is, generally moving away from very formal, structured, log frame based approaches to reporting and monitoring for those phases. It doesn't have to be a frightening prospect if there is a really strong partnership dialogue that goes on between the funders and the conservation delivery organisations, the grantee partners. Not sure if that answers precisely. As I say, there's a good bit of detailed recommendations in the handbook as well.
Thanks, Helen. So I've got a couple more questions popped in. Is there a glossary in the handbook, and is SOS using particular terminology, for example, conservation standards terminology?
There's not a glossary in the handbook, and we're not referring specifically to conservation standards here, although we absolutely recognise those within the organisation. The terminology, I suppose, that we use is around the community-centred conservation and what that is, what that truly entails, what the characteristics of that are, and how that differs from other kind of community-based approaches.
Thanks, Helen. And a general question here about our opinion on the current landscape fundraising on behalf of environmental and conservation initiatives. 2024 was an odd year for us all. I mean, I would agree with that. Yes, it was a challenging year. It felt like a lot of, from my perspective as the Trusts and Foundations fundraiser for SOS, yeah, I would agree. It did feel like there was a lot of tightening up on criteria for specific funders and huge amounts of competition, which is, it's a lot of organisations all gunning for the same funding. And I don't know, I think people are becoming more aware of the absolutely vital importance of conservation initiatives. And so there's more people doing good work, which puts funders under pressure to come up with the necessary resource to make everything happen. Yeah, I would absolutely commend everyone to have a look at the Environmental Funders Network report, Where the Green Grants Went for 2024. It's a really interesting insight into what's happening at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to signpost to EFN as well. Their efforts, both on the funder side to try to expand the pool of philanthropy that is directed to environmental causes is incredibly important work, but then the support that they offer to fundraisers within environmental organisations as well is absolutely invaluable.
Absolutely.
Landscape for sure, but we hope that encouraging more funders to consider different approaches to how they fund and the partnerships that they invest in being long-term, going towards the North Star of the long-term preservation of a particular landscape. For example, that that can really add well, stability, I suppose, to conservation funding for particular initiatives. Because I think that short-term project cycles, or maximum funding of 1 or 2 years, for example, from one funder to one grantee, can be quite destabilizing to organisations that would want to adopt these kind of community-centred approaches, but would be under pressure to come up with those very rigid outcomes and outputs within a 1 to 2 year period, when, as we've seen, that's the co-creation phase. That's when you're really getting to grips with understanding what needs to happen within a specific context for conservation to really stick. So yeah, we're hopeful that that movement, that transition within the funder landscape continues in a positive direction as well.
Thanks, Helen. We've only got 4 minutes left of the call. Are there any more questions from anyone? If you just want to type quickly into the chat, or if you want to give closing remarks and give us all a couple more minutes back.
Happy to do that if there's no more questions. As I say, I think the handbook, I hope, will be a really practical tool. We'll be sending it out to everybody on this call, but it's also openly, open source, freely available on our website, and we'll be encouraging conservation colleagues and funders, both our existing cherished funders and funders who are not directly supporting us or have other priorities. This is based, I suppose, on our experiences in orangutan landscape, but the principles here are really broadly applicable, because we did do a wide consultation within the conservation sector and with many funders, including members of EFN, the Environmental Funders Network. So we really think and hope that the content of the handbook will be practical and useful wherever conservation is happening in the world, and whether, as I say, whether you're a conservation delivery person or organisation or a funder. We hope that this can contribute to the movement that is very clearly already underway towards long-term, flexible, strategic funding partnerships to enable really robust conservation outcomes. Brilliant. I haven't seen any more questions popping up, so I will
none to me.
Back a couple of minutes in your day. Please do keep in touch. We'll follow up with everybody later this morning, and as I say, really open and interested genuinely in your feedback about this, and want to continue this conversation. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.